Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. So, I want you to think about how we usually talk about intelligence in modern society. We
Yeah.
tend to talk about it as if it were, just a collection of acquired knowledge.
Right, exactly.
We kind of think of the human mind like a giant filing cabinet. The idea is that you go to school, you study hard, and you just stuff more files into that cabinet.
You learn algebra, you learn
You
vocabulary.
learn how to code, history, whatever. And the more files you have, well, the smarter you are.
Which makes sense on the surface.
It does. It is a very comforting, very intuitive way to look at human capability. But what if that entire framework is fundamentally upside down?
Right.
What if intelligence isn't the files you collect, but a biological information processing system? Like an engine that begins sorting people long before they ever even set foot in a classroom.
It is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, it really challenges some of our most deeply held assumptions about human potential.
It really does.
And for this deep dive, our mission is to analyze the complex interaction between biological brain processes,
Yeah.
psychometric measurement systems, and the modern socioeconomic structures that disproportionately reward cognitive complexity.
Right, the whole system.
Exactly. And to do this, we are using a monumental and honestly highly debated text as our analytical entry point.
Yeah, we should probably name the book early on here.
Yes. It's called The G Factor, The Science of Mental Ability by Arthur R. Jensen.
Such a massive piece of work.
It is. This book meticulously traces the scientific concept of general intelligence,
Yeah.
from its mathematical discovery over a century ago, down to its actual physiological roots in the brain, and finally outward to its sweeping societal impacts.
And before we get into the really dense science of this, I want to ask you, the listener, to hold on to that engine metaphor.
That's a good anchor.
Right. Just imagine your mind not as a static filing cabinet of facts, but as a dynamic engine. Because today, we are looking at Charles Spearman's discovery of general intelligence.
Which, in scientific literature, is simply known as G.
Just the letter G. So, to define G right at the outset so we have a clear foundation, what exactly is it?
Well, it refers to the general factor underlying performance across highly diverse cognitive tasks. It appears consistently, mathematically, in psychometric analysis.
So it's not specific knowledge.
No, not at all. It's not how well you play chess or how many languages you speak.
Or how well you can, memorize a map or something.
Exactly. Rather, Jensen argues that G represents the underlying efficiency of the neural system itself.
The raw machinery.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to trace this overarching system from its biological design to the incentives it creates in our modern society, the outcomes it drives in the real world, why this sorting mechanism actually persists across generations, and finally, its interconnection with the massive structures of our world.
Things like the economy and the education system.
Exactly. But before we take that first step, we need to set the rules of engagement for this deep dive.
That is crucial, actually, because this is a systems-level analysis. It is not advocacy, and it is certainly not a prescription for policy.
Right, we're not telling anyone what to do.
No. The goal of this discussion is simply to map the system exactly as Jensen presents it in his research. We are stepping into what is undeniably highly controversial terrain.
Yeah, touching on biology, inequality, human value, heavy stuff.
Very heavy.
Mm.
But we are going to maintain a calm, objective lens. We are examining the data and the theory to understand the architecture of this system without moralizing or taking a side on the public debate surrounding it.
Right. So let's look at the design of this system, starting with how we even figured out it existed in the first place.
The history here is fascinating.
Yeah, if you go back to the early days of psychology, like late 1800s and early 1900s, scientists were trying to figure out how to measure human capability.
You have pioneers like Francis Galton, for example.
Right, and Galton thought intelligence was all about sensory acuity. He was testing people's reaction times to whistles, or how well they could distinguish between two slightly different weights.
Galton's premise was that, well, since all information comes to us through the senses, the most intelligent people must have the most acute senses.
Which sounds logical.
It does. But when he actually ran the data, it was a dead end. Those simple sensory tests just didn't correlate with real-world achievements at all.
Right, the people who could hear the highest pitch weren't necessarily the top scholars at Cambridge.
Exactly.
And then you get to Alfred Binet in France.
Yes, Binet is a huge figure here.
The French government basically asks him to figure out which kids are going to struggle in the Parisian school system. So Binet essentially throws everything at the wall to see what sticks.
He creates what Jensen calls a hodgepodge of test items.
Right, like, can the child name the days of the week? Can they copy a drawing of a diamond? Can they repeat a string of numbers backward?
And Binet's practical approach worked incredibly well. His test was highly predictive of school performance.
But the catch is, Binet didn't really know why it worked.
No, he didn't. He wasn't isolating a specific mechanism. He was just gathering a messy aggregate of skills.
Just a big bucket of tasks.
Exactly. It was Charles Spearman in 1904 who changed the paradigm. Spearman wanted to look beneath the surface of these hodgepodge tests.
And how did he do that?
Well, to do this, he invented a statistical method called factor analysis. He looked at the correlation matrices of how people performed on vastly different cognitive tests.
And without modern computers, right? Which is wild.
It's an astounding mathematical feat for the time. And through that, he discovered what is known as the positive manifold.
Okay, let's break down the positive manifold, because this is kind of the bedrock of the whole theory.
It really is.
If I understand this correctly, it means that if you take a large group of people and give them a bunch of cognitive tests, say a vocabulary test, a spatial reasoning test where you rotate 3D shapes in your head.
Yeah, or a complex math test, maybe a logic puzzle.
Right. People's scores across those very different tests will rise and fall together.
Exactly.
Like, if you are good at one cognitively demanding thing, you are statistically more likely to be good at another completely unrelated thing.
That is the positive manifold in action. If you plot the scores of thousands of individuals on dozens of different tests, you don't get a random scatter plot.
It's not just noise.
No, you get positive correlations across the board. The person who excels at spatial reasoning is statistically highly likely to also excel at vocabulary.
Even though rotating a shape and knowing the definition of an obscure word seem entirely unrelated.
Right. And factor analysis is the mathematical tool that strains out the specific variance.
Meaning the parts of the score related only to knowing math or only to having a good ear for music.
Precisely. Once you mathematically strip away all those specific localized skills, you are left with a single, massive, common underlying variable.
And that's what Spearman gave the label G to.
Yes, that common factor is G.
And this leads to a concept Spearman called the indifference of the indicator. That phrasing is a little dense, but it essentially means the specific test doesn't actually matter, does it?
No, it doesn't. The specific content of a test, whether it uses numbers, words, or geometric shapes, is virtually irrelevant to measuring G, provided the test meets certain criteria.
What kind of criteria?
As long as the task requires mental effort and what Spearman called the adduction of relations and correlates.
Meaning you have to figure out how abstract things relate to one another.
Exactly. Deduce rules, spot patterns. If it requires that, it will measure G.
So wait, I could theoretically design a test using entirely made-up alien symbols.
You could, absolutely.
As long as the test requires you to figure out the complex logical rules governing how those alien symbols interact, performance on that bizarre test will correlate strongly with performance on a standard English vocabulary test or a calculus exam.
Yes. The test content is just the vehicle. It is merely a delivery mechanism to force the brain to do complex work. G is the underlying engine doing that work.
I understand the vehicle and engine metaphor historically, but I actually want to offer a different analogy, one that might map a little better onto our modern understanding of technology.
Sure, let's hear it.
Think of the human brain like a computer. Your specific skills, your ability to speak French, your knowledge of Excel, your memorization of historical dates, those are the software programs loaded onto your hard drive.
Okay, I follow.
They are specific applications you downloaded from your environment.
Following that analogy, working memory would be the RAM, the temporary workspace where you hold information while you are actively manipulating it.
Exactly. But G is not the software. It's not Microsoft Word or your web browser. Think of G as the central processing unit, the CPU.
Right.
It's the raw clock speed of the motherboard. It dictates how fast and how efficiently the machine can run any software you decide to install.
That is actually a highly accurate analogy according to Jensen's framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jensen argues explicitly that G is not a cognitive process in itself. It's not the act of remembering. It's not the act of perceiving.
It's the speed limit for those acts.
Basically.
Yeah.
It reflects the fundamental properties of the brain's information processing efficiency, entirely stripped of cultural knowledge or learned strategies.
So when Spearman's factor analysis does its mathematical work, it is essentially stripping away all the cultural software
Stripping away the specific skills you learned in school, yes.
and isolating the raw biological efficiency of the hardware.
Correct.
And this is where Jensen's book shifts from statistical math to something much more profound. He doesn't just leave G as a mathematical artifact on a piece of paper.
Oh, he takes us under the biological hood.
Right, because if G is the CPU, what is the physical material making up that processor? Let's dive into the physiological evidence, because this moves the conversation entirely out of the realm of sociology.
Jensen outlines several fascinating biological correlates of G that root the concept firmly in neurophysiology.
Let's start with the first one.
The first is nerve conduction velocity, or NCV. This is not a metaphor. This is literally the speed at which electrical impulses travel along the axons of your neurons.
And when we talk about that speed, we have to talk about how the brain is physically wired.
Yeah.
This is dictated by myelination, right?
Yes,
The physical insulation on the wires.
exactly. The myelin sheath is a fatty substance that surrounds the axon of a neuron. It acts exactly like the rubber insulation on a copper electrical wire.
So it keeps the signal from leaking out.
Right. In the nervous system, action potentials, the electrical signals don't just flow smoothly like water. They jump across tiny gaps in the myelin called the nodes of Ranvier.
Oh, interesting.
This is called saltatory conduction. The thicker and more intact the myelination, the faster and more efficiently the electrical impulse can travel from one part of the brain to another without the signal degrading or leaking.
Okay, so how does that relate to G?
Jensen points to studies showing that higher G is correlated with faster nerve conduction velocity. The signals simply move faster and with more fidelity across the brain's network.
So a brain with higher G literally has a physically faster wiring system.
That's the argument, yes.
But this brings us to a paradox that Jensen highlights regarding brain metabolism.
The glucose studies.
Yeah. If the signals are moving faster and the brain is processing these incredibly complex, abstract puzzles, you would naturally assume the brain is working much harder.
Right, like an engine revving.
Exactly. You'd think a high G brain is burning massive amounts of energy, like a computer fan whirring at maximum speed. But the physiological data shows the exact opposite.
It does.
Let's walk through Richard Hare's Tetris study, because when I read this in the source material, it completely flipped my understanding of mental effort.
It is a remarkable piece of research that visually captures what Brie actually is. Richard Hare used EET scans, positron emission tomography, to measure the glucose metabolic rate in the brains of individuals.
So they can see the energy being used.
Right. Essentially, they inject a safe radioactive tracer attached to glucose, so they can see exactly which parts of the brain are consuming sugar, which is the brain's fuel.
And they mapped the brains of subjects while they did what?
While they learned to play the classic video game Tetris.
Okay, and Tetris is perfect for this because it requires rapid visual spatial processing, quick decision-making, and anticipating future moves.
It is highly cognitively demanding if you've never played it before.
Right.
Initially, when subjects first played the game, their brains lit up on the PET scan. They were consuming a massive amount of glucose. The brain was working incredibly hard to process this novel, complex task.
That makes sense.
But here is the critical part. Over 30 to 60 days of practice, as the subjects mastered the game, their overall brain glucose uptake actually decreased.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So as they got better playing at faster speeds and higher levels, their brains used less energy. Did the brain just get lazy?
Not lazy, deeply efficient. The necessary neural pathways had been established, and the tasks became automatized. The brain no longer needed to recruit vast networks of neurons to solve the problem. It streamlined the process.
That is fascinating. But how does that connect back to Jensen and general intelligence?
What is crucial to Jensen's argument is how this correlates with intelligence. Individuals with higher G scores not only improved more rapidly at the game, but their glucose uptake dropped significantly more than those with lower G scores.
Oh, wow.
Jensen refers to this phenomenon as the conservation of G. A high G brain requires less metabolic energy to process complex information once it grasps the underlying pattern.
So the high G brain is like a highly tuned aerodynamic sports car.
It's a good way to put it.
Like it uses less gas to cruise at 100 miles an hour than a clunky sedan uses to go 60.
Exactly.
The biological efficiency is the intelligence.
Yes, and another part of that efficiency is a reduction in what Jensen calls neural noise.
Neural noise.
Right, and when we think about processing speed, we usually just think about raw speed. But Jensen argues it's actually about the consistency of the speed.
Okay, unpack that for me. What does that mean in testing?
The metric used in psychometrics here is reaction time standard deviation, or RTSD. In laboratory experiments, researchers use what are called elementary cognitive tasks. These are so simple that anyone can do them without any prior knowledge.
Like what?
For example, a subject sits in front of a console, and when a specific light flashes, they have to move their finger and press a button as fast as possible.
That sounds literally exactly like Galton's old sensory tests from the 1800s. Why do these work when Galton's failed?
Well, because modern instruments can measure the response down to milliseconds, and modern researchers aren't just looking at the average speed.
What are they looking at?
They are looking at the standard deviation, the variance across hundreds of trials. High-G individuals don't just react faster on average. Their reaction times are incredibly tight and consistent from trial to trial.
Oh, I see. So they have less static on the line.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. Low-G individuals might have some very fast reaction times on a few trials, but they also have very slow ones. There is a widespread of variability.
And Jensen thinks that variability is what?
Jensen hypothesizes this variability is due to random biological noise in neural transmission, perhaps microscopic fluctuations in the excitatory potential of neurons, or slight misfires in the chemical synapses.
So the high-G brain has a cleaner, more stable, more reliable signal.
Every time the processor is called upon, it fires with precision.
And just to add one more biological factor from the text that sounds almost like science fiction, brain pH levels.
Ah, yes.
Jensen mentions research showing a correlation between greater brain alkalinity, like a higher pH level in the intracellular fluid, and higher IQ. How on earth does the acidity of your brain affect how smart you are?
It sounds strange, but it comes back to the fundamental physics of how neurons communicate.
Okay.
In action potential, the electrical firing of a neuron requires a certain threshold of electrical charge to be reached. The intracellular pH affects this threshold.
How so?
The more alkaline the environment within the neuron, the lower the threshold for neural excitability.
Meaning the neurons are primed and ready to fire with less effort. They require less of a push to send the signal down the line.
It is a compelling frontier of research. When you aggregate all of these biological markers, thicker myelination allowing faster nerve conduction, extreme glucose efficiency in the PET scans, a lack of neural noise creating highly consistent reaction times, and even intracellular pH priming the neurons to fire.
It's a lot of physical evidence.
It is. They all point to G as a fundamentally physiological reality. It is a biological hardware specification, not just a mathematical artifact drawn from vocabulary tests.
So if we step back and look at the design of this whole system, G is the biological hardware. It is the raw processing speed, the signal clarity, and the energy efficiency of the human brain's network.
Right.
But biological hardware doesn't exist in a vacuum. It only matters when it interacts with the external world.
Of course.
Like, a fast processor is only useful if the environment demands fast processing. If G is this innate physiological reality, how does the modern world interact with it?
And that brings us to the incentive architecture of modern life.
Let's get into that.
To understand the modern incentive structure, we have to contrast it with history.
Okay.
For the vast majority of human existence, societies primarily rewarded physical strength, endurance, or the mastery of highly repetitive, specialized labor.
Sure.
In an agrarian society or early industrial society, if you had high physical stamina and could learn a specific localized skill, like blacksmithing or farming a specific crop, you could thrive.
Because the cognitive demands of daily survival were largely routine.
Exactly. But modern technological society has fundamentally shifted its incentive structure.
Right. We've moved from an economy of muscle to an economy of mind.
And not just any mind, but a mind capable of managing constant novelty. Today, the global economy overwhelmingly rewards high information processing capacity.
The ability to handle complexity.
It rewards the ability to take in vast amounts of abstract data, recognize patterns that haven't been seen before, and adapt quickly.
I want the listener to really think about what this means for their own life.
It touches everything.
Think about your workplace, or the college you attended, or even the process of applying for a mortgage. We usually think of these things as just bureaucratic hurdles.
Right, just annoying paperwork.
But if we look at them through Jensen's framework, how do these structures act as giant, invisible sorting algorithms?
It's a great question.
Because we don't like to think of a corporate HR department or a university admissions office as a biological sorting mechanism, but that is exactly what the psychometric data suggests they are.
They inadvertently function exactly like that. Education systems and modern labor markets have established strict cognitive thresholds required to manage the complexity they deal with.
Thresholds. That's a key word here.
Yes, Jensen emphasizes a very important nuance here.
Yeah.
G is not just a simple linear predictor of success where every extra point of IQ equals an extra dollar in your paycheck.
It's not a straight line.
No, rather it acts as a rigid threshold variable.
Let's explain that threshold concept. It's like the sign at the amusement park that says you must be this tall to ride the roller coaster.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. To become a successful aerospace engineer, a neurosurgeon, or a high-level corporate strategist, there is a massive amount of abstract complexity you must be able to process simultaneously.
Right.
No amount of intense studying, no amount of sheer willpower, and no amount of charisma can compensate if an individual's biological G level falls below the threshold required to rapidly process the mathematics or the spatial relationships of those fields.
The hardware just can't run the software.
Exactly.
But once you are above the threshold, other things start to matter a lot more, right?
Absolutely. If you take a room full of theoretical physicists, they all have exceptionally high G. They all clear the threshold.
Obviously.
But the one who goes on to win the Nobel Prize might not be the one with the absolute highest G in the room. At that point, it might be the person with the most creativity, the most obsessive drive, or the best collaborative personality.
So G gets you in the door, but it doesn't guarantee you're the best once you're inside.
Precisely. But the threshold itself is an absolute non-negotiable gatekeeper for entry into the room.
And the data on job complexity proves this out beautifully.
It does.
The validity of G, meaning how accurately a cognitive test predicts if you will actually be good at your job, changes depending on what the job is.
This is a crucial finding in industrial organizational psychology. The correlation between a person's G level and their job performance increases proportionately with the complexity of the job.
So for a simpler job.
For simple, highly repetitive tasks like packing boxes on an assembly line or basic data entry, G matters very little. Once you learn the routine, your processing speed doesn't give you much of an advantage.
Right, it's just muscle memory at that point.
In those jobs, conscientiousness or physical stamina are much better predictors of success.
But if you scale up the complexity, let's say an air traffic controller.
Perfect example.
You were looking at a radar screen, calculating the speed, altitude, and trajectory of dozens of planes simultaneously, and the variables are constantly changing due to weather.
In a role like that, which requires constant, novel problem solving and massive working memory capacity, G is the single best predictor of success.
Because it demands raw processing power.
Exactly. As jobs become more complex, they demand more raw processing power. The environment itself becomes a strict test of the biological hardware.
Which makes me wonder about the escalation of everyday life, outside of just our careers.
Oh, everyday life is definitely escalating.
Right. If society keeps upgrading its operating system, think about it. We are digitizing our tax codes, making healthcare navigation incredibly bureaucratic, replacing human tellers with complex software interfaces.
Having to use multi-factor authentication just to read an email.
Exactly. Aren't we constantly raising the cognitive threshold just to exist as a functional adult? We are continuously demanding more from the human CPU.
You've hit on the central friction of modernity. This constant, relentless upgrading of societal complexity means the world is becoming structurally less navigable for those with lower biological processing speeds.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
We are building an environment that heavily favors one specific biological trait above all others. And this creates a steep divergence in how different groups of people experience daily reality.
Which leads us to the predictable and often harsh outcomes of this system.
Right, let's look at those outcomes.
We generally like to tell ourselves a very optimistic story about progress.
Of course.
We think that technology levels the playing field. The internet gives everyone on Earth access to the exact same Wikipedia articles, the same online courses, the same data.
So the logic goes, technology should erase cognitive inequality.
Right.
Unfortunately, from a psychometric perspective, the exact opposite occurs.
Why is that?
Societies with increasing technological and institutional complexity do not level the playing field. They create environments where innate differences in information processing ability become drastically amplified.
Because if you have a massive, fast biological processor, having access to more data is a gold mine. You can synthesize it, find the patterns, and leverage it. But if you have a slower processor, dumping a terabyte of unstructured data on you doesn't help. It just creates overwhelming noise.
Exactly, and this dynamic leads to a disproportionate representation of high G individuals in the most lucrative, cognitively demanding fields.
Right. The data Jensen presents shows this massive clustering effect in science, engineering, law, and complex executive decision-making.
And this clustering is not just a sociological curiosity. It has massive structural economic consequences.
Like what?
Jensen cites Raymond Cattell's application of basic supply and demand curves to cognitive ability.
Supply and demand for brain power.
Think of it like any other economic resource. In a highly complex technological society, the economic demand for high-level problem-solving is nearly infinite.
Companies are desperate for people who can write complex algorithms.
Or manage global supply chains or design new pharmaceuticals.
The demand is huge, but the biological supply of high G is mathematically fixed. It follows a normal bell curve. Most people sit in the middle, and as you get to the extreme high end of processing speed, there are fewer and fewer people.
Precisely. So if you have a modern economy screaming for millions of brilliant software engineers, but the biological distribution dictates that only a small, fixed percentage of the population possesses the cognitive threshold to actually do that highly abstract work.
The price of that labor skyrockets.
Yes. The economic value of a person's developed ability is based on the ratio of the demand for that ability to the population supply.
So because high G is statistically scarce, its economic reward in a tech-heavy society is exponentially higher than in an agrarian society.
Exactly.
It is a structural driver of economic inequality that is entirely blind to your social class or background. It doesn't matter who your parents were. If you have the rare biological processing power the market demands, you are rewarded.
But on the flip side of that massive reward is a devastating concept Jensen brings up from the researcher Lloyd Humphreys.
Right.
It's called inadequate learning syndrome, or ILS. And this is where the societal implications get very real.
So what is ILS exactly?
Humphreys describes ILS as a growing social epidemic, but we have to be very careful with how we define it.
Okay.
It is important to clarify that this is not a sudden biological drop in the population's overall intelligence. The hardware hasn't changed.
People aren't getting inherently less smart.
No. Rather, ILS is the inability of a significant segment of the population to meet the rapidly rising cognitive demands of the modern job market and modern life.
Even when they are provided with adequate educational opportunities.
Exactly.
It is the struggle with the baseline operating system of modernity. I want to paint a picture of what ILS actually looks like because it's easy to abstract this.
Please do.
It looks like a person sitting at a kitchen table, staring at a densely worded medical insurance form, trying to understand copays, deductibles, and out-of-network percentages, and being completely paralyzed by the interacting variables.
Yes.
It looks like trying to navigate an automated phone tree to fix a bank error, or reading a complex transit schedule that has contingencies for weekends and holidays.
Which for some is just standard daily life.
Right. For a high G person, these are minor, boring annoyances. They process the rules quickly and move on. But for a low G person, these are insurmountable, terrifying barriers.
And because society interprets failure to navigate these systems as a lack of effort or a lack of education, it causes immense psychological distress.
We tell people, just read the instructions carefully.
Assuming their biological hardware can process the nested logic of those instructions.
Right.
When they fail, society blames their character, rather than recognizing a mismatch between their processing speed and the environment's complexity.
And the gap between these two experiences of the world widens even further over time due to what psychometricians call the spread of G effect.
Ah, yes, the spread of G.
I have always wondered about this phenomenon in daily life. You meet some people who just seem to know more about everything. They know a little bit about geopolitics, they know how a combustion engine works, they know the history of a random country. They aren't explicitly studying Wikipedia all day, but they have this massive reservoir of incidental knowledge. Why is that?
Well, high G individuals act like cognitive sponges.
Sponges.
Because their neural processing is so efficient. Remember the Tetra study? They require less energy to process patterns. They constantly soak up incidental information from their environment, even without focused, deliberate study.
So they don't even have to try.
Often, no. They hear a news report in the background, they grasp the context, they connect the dots to something they read a year ago, and they store the information automatically in their vast associative networks.
So the high G person is walking through the world, passively downloading data, forming a richer and richer map of reality.
While the low G person is using all their available cognitive bandwidth, just struggling to process the immediate necessary inputs of the day.
It is a compounding interest of the mind. Over a lifetime, this incidental learning accumulates, creating a staggering knowledge gap.
It really does. And this brings us to a massive point of friction.
The pushback.
These outcomes, the extreme economic rewards for high G and the marginalization of those with lower G are highly controversial,
Of course they are.
suggesting that economic and social inequality is driven fundamentally by biological processing limits, clashes directly with the core ethos of modern democratic societies.
We want to believe in the blank slate. We want to believe that anyone can be anything if they just work hard enough, or if we fund the schools properly, or if we remove systemic biases.
Which leads us to the structural tensions keeping this system in place and why it is so difficult to talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about the conflict of narratives here.
If we look at the bigger picture, the dominant public and social narratives overwhelmingly treat intelligence as entirely malleable.
Right.
The popular institutional view is that intelligence is socially constructed. It is seen as a byproduct of cultural privilege, vocabulary exposure in early childhood, or simply the result of attending a well-funded school.
But Jensen's psychometric and biological data insists on a physiological anchor.
Yes, we are mapping this tension. We are not taking a side on the moral implications, but the conflict between the biological data Jensen presents and the public narrative we prefer to tell ourselves is stark.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener, because there's a very famous, very powerful counterargument to Jensen's biological determinism.
And to his credit, Jensen covers it in the text,
Right. I am talking about the Flynn effect.
the Flynn effect.
It is a well-documented fact that average IQ scores have been rising globally in almost every industrialized nation for decades.
They have.
Generation after generation, the raw scores go up. Biology and genetics do not evolve that fast. We haven't evolved new brains since 1920.
No, we certainly haven't.
So if the hardware isn't changing but the scores are going up, doesn't that fundamentally prove that intelligence is environmental? Doesn't that prove we are upgrading the hardware through better society?
That is the standard intuitive interpretation of the Flynn effect, and it is a very strong argument. But Jensen's analysis, using factor analysis, provides a highly technical and different conclusion.
How does he explain it?
When psychometricians break down these rising IQ scores over the decades, they find something fascinating. The games do not load on the G factor.
Wait, let me make sure I understand that. The overall score on the piece of paper goes up. The average person today gets more questions right than the average person in 1950.
Yes.
But the G part doesn't change. How is that mathematically possible?
We have to go back to Spearman's original equation. Every test score is made up of two components, G, the general biological processing efficiency, and S, the specific variance.
Right, the specific skills.
Exactly. The Jew-Nevis variance includes things like familiarity with the multiple-choice test format, specific test-taking strategies, exposure to the specific vocabulary used, and general cultural knowledge.
Okay.
Jensen argues that the Flynn effect entirely reflects massive improvements in the Jew-Cis variance.
So people are just getting better at the specific skills required to take the tests.
Yes. Think about the environmental changes over the 20th century. We have vastly better childhood nutrition, which allows the brain to reach its genetic potential.
Right.
We have universal schooling that trains children from age 5 to sit at a desk and solve abstract paper puzzles.
Yeah, that wasn't a universal thing 100 years ago.
And we live in a highly visual, complex environment full of screens and symbols. We have trained the population to be excellent at the S factors measured by IQ tests.
Wow.
But when you isolate the pure G factor, the raw biological processing speed and neural efficiency, the data suggests it is not fundamentally increasing.
Let me bring back the computer analogy.
Go for it.
What Jensen is saying is that over the last century, we have given everyone much better software. We upgraded the operating system, we installed better apps, we optimized the code through better schools and nutrition.
Yes.
And because the software is better, the computer performs better on the test. But the CPU itself, the biological clock speed of the motherboard, remains exactly the same.
The hardware hasn't evolved.
And while this illusion of rising intelligence is happening, the actual biological system is creating intense, hidden feedback loops in our society. Let's map those loops out.
The loops are entirely self-reinforcing, and they span generations.
Where does it start?
First, genetic inheritance heavily influences cognitive traits, setting the baseline biological limits of an individual's G.
Right.
These inherited biological traits then shape a person's educational and occupational pathways from a very early age.
How so?
A child with a naturally high G processor quickly grasps complex subjects, find school rewarding, and is naturally sorted into advanced, enriched classes.
And then the environment kicks in to amplify the biology. Because that child is now in an advanced class, surrounded by complex stimuli and demanding teachers, their cognitive development is pushed to its absolute maximum limit.
Exactly.
While a child with lower G gets frustrated, drops out of the complex tracks, and misses out on that environmental amplification.
Yes, the biology selects the environment, and then the environment reinforces the biology.
It's a loop.
But the most powerful feedback loop occurs when these individuals enter adulthood and the dating pool. This brings us to the concept of assortative mating.
Assortative mating.
We have to look at how the modern meritocracy inadvertently acts as a massive genetic sorting mechanism.
Well, in a modern economy, we select heavily, almost ruthlessly, for G. We use standardized tests like the SAT or the LSAT to filter people into college, and then highly complex interviews to filter them into professions.
Exactly. As individuals sort into elite universities and specialized, highly complex careers like law, medicine, or technology, they are physically relocated to specific geographic hubs or specific institutional bubbles.
Right.
They are increasingly surrounded exclusively by peers with similar cognitive and educational profiles.
And consequently,
humans being social creatures, they increasingly pair up and mate with partners of similar educational and cognitive levels.
so you have two high-G software engineers who meet at a tech company in Silicon Valley, or two high-G lawyers who meet at an Ivy League law school. They get married, and they have kids. And because G is highly heritable, they are combining their genetic traits.
That is the mechanism of assortative mating. Over multiple generations, this concentrated matching naturally pools cognitive traits at the extreme tails of the distribution.
So it pushes people to the edges?
It creates distinct genetic and environmental silos. The high G parents pass on the biological hardware, and they also provide a highly enriched, resource-heavy environment for the software.
Which continually reproduces and hardens the cognitive stratification of society.
It makes the sorting mechanism persistent across time.
Which means as long as technology continues to advance and continues to place a premium on this raw biological processing power, this societal sorting mechanism will only accelerate.
The divide will only get wider.
To understand what this means for our future, we have to look at the macro-level interconnections, which brings us to our final area of analysis.
The interconnectedness of this system with how we govern the world. The fundamental reality is that the demand for high-level information processing is permanently tethered to human progress.
Yeah.
As long as a society pursues technological innovation, medical breakthroughs, and economic growth, cognitive ability will become increasingly important.
There is no reversing the complexity of the modern world short of total societal collapse.
No, we cannot go back to an agrarian incentive structure.
So we have to reconnect this biological G system to the larger nested systems we use to run our countries. We're talking about education policy, labor markets, welfare systems, and demographic changes.
Exactly.
If G is, as Jensen exhaustively argues, biologically anchored and relatively fixed in its efficiency, then pouring billions of dollars into educational interventions while completely ignoring those biological processing limits might lead to massive systemic frustration.
It creates a profound misalignment. We build policies based on a model of human nature that the psychometric data contradicts.
So we always ask at the end of our shows, what is the crisis in perception here? Where is the blind spot?
The crisis in perception is that our public debates, our grand educational policies, and our civic institutions largely treat intelligence as a malleable social construct.
Shaped primarily by the quality of schooling, the wealth of a neighborhood, or cultural opportunity.
Yes. Meanwhile, Jensen's extensive psychometric and biological work argues that a much deeper physiological system, a system of myelination, glucose efficiency, and neural noise, sets the underlying non-negotiable limits on cognitive performance.
And the danger of maintaining that misperception, what happens when society refuses to acknowledge the biological hardware?
Ignoring this biological layer leads to policy debates that fundamentally misunderstand the structural drivers of educational and economic inequality.
Like treating a broken phone screen by updating the operating system.
Exactly. We try to solve hardware differences with software patches. We assume that if outcomes are unequal, if one group succeeds and another fails in a complex environment, the system must be artificially biased, or the teaching methods must be fundamentally flawed. While environmental factors, systemic biases, and educational resources absolutely matter and must be improved, completely ignoring the biological variance in raw processing capacity guarantees that our societal solutions will constantly fail to achieve the total equality of outcome they promise.
And when those promises fail,
It leads to deep, corrosive social frustration and finger-pointing.
I want you to think back to that CPU analogy one last time. If our socioeconomic system increasingly, relentlessly rewards a biological processing speed that the average human brain simply cannot change through hard work or sheer will,
Yeah.
what happens when the baseline complexity of daily life entirely outpaces the biological limits of the average citizen? Are we inadvertently designing a future world that is fundamentally incompatible with the natural distribution of human biology?
That is the ultimate question.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.